The entire church went silent when the cowboy chose the one seat everyone else avoided. What did he see that nobody else did? A wooden chair crashed against the church floor, and every head turned at once. Snowmelt dripped from the cowboy's coat as he walked straight down the aisle. Row after row was full, yet one seat remained empty beside a woman sitting alone. The floorboards creaked under his boots. He stopped, removed his hat, and quietly asked a question that made the room hold its breath. What happened next would linger far beyond that Sunday morning. If stories of courage, kindness, and unexpected love speak to your heart, come along for the journey. The autumn wind moved softly through Dry Creek, Montana territory, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant wood smoke down from the red rock hills. Every Sunday morning, the church bell rang at 9 o'clock, and every Sunday morning Ruby Hayes walked the same dusty road alone. She wore the same dark blue dress she had carefully mended 3 times. Her Bible rested against her chest. Her pace never hurried, never slowed. People nodded when they passed her. Some offered polite smiles. Most simply looked away. Ruby was used to it. 3 years had passed since the silver mine collapse beyond Miller Ridge. 3 years since the man she had planned to marry never came home. The accident had taken 6 men. Yet somehow the whispers had settled around her name like dust that refused to wash away. No one said such things to her face. But small towns had ways of speaking without speaking. Conversations paused when she entered a room. Empty seats appeared beside her. Invitations never arrived. The church sat at the center of Dry Creek, a simple white wooden building with narrow windows and a steeple that leaned slightly west from years of prairie winds. Ruby always sat in the last row, always on the same side, always alone. That Sunday the church filled quickly. Ranch families arrived in wagons. Children chased each other between the hitching posts. Boots scraped across the wooden floor. Laughter echoed beneath the rafters. Ruby took her seat and opened her Bible. The empty chair beside her remained empty, just as it always did. Then the front door opened. A stranger stepped inside. Tall, broad-shouldered. A weathered tan hat rested low on his brow. Dust still clung to his boots from the trail. He paused near the entrance and looked around. Every seat was taken. Every seat except one, the chair beside Ruby. A few people exchanged glances. Old Mrs. Cooper lowered her voice and whispered something to the woman beside her. Ruby felt her stomach tighten. The stranger started walking, not toward the front, not toward an aisle seat, toward her. The sound of his boots seemed unusually loud against the wooden floor. Then he stopped beside the empty chair. "Mind if I sit here, ma'am?" His voice was calm, respectful. Ruby blinked. For a moment she wasn't sure she had heard correctly. "No," she said quietly. "I don't mind." The man smiled. A small smile, easy, natural. Then he sat down. The church suddenly felt very still. Ruby kept her eyes on her Bible, but she could feel people watching. The stranger seemed not to notice. Or perhaps he noticed and simply didn't care. When the service ended, families slowly filed outside into the cool sunlight. Ruby stepped onto the church porch and adjusted her shawl. Behind her, 2 women stood near the water barrel. Their voices carried farther than they intended. "Poor fellow. Nobody's told him, has they? Told him what? Who she is." Ruby's fingers tightened around her Bible. She had heard versions of those words for years. Usually, she kept walking. Today, she almost did. Then another voice answered. A man's voice, warm and unbothered. "I reckon she's Ruby Hayes." The women fell silent. Ruby turned. The stranger stood a few yards away beside the hitching rail. Sunlight caught the edge of his face. One corner of his mouth lifted slightly, as if none of it mattered. As if she were simply another person standing outside a church on a Sunday morning. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Ruby found herself looking directly into someone's eyes without seeing pity, or caution, or judgment. Only kindness. The autumn wind moved between them. Neither spoke, but something small shifted inside her. Not trust, Just a tiny crack in a door she thought had closed forever. The stranger tipped his hat, then walked toward the far end of town. And for reasons Ruby couldn't explain, she watched until he disappeared beyond the general store. The next morning arrived clear and cold. A thin layer of frost covered the fence posts outside Ruby's cabin. The creek behind the property moved quietly beneath pale sunlight. She carried a bucket from the well and paused when she noticed wagon tracks still fresh in the dirt road. Dry Creek was waking up. Smoke rose from chimneys. A ranch hand crossed town with 2 mules. Somewhere a hammer struck wood in a steady rhythm. Life moved as it always had. Yet Ruby found herself thinking about the stranger from church. She told herself it meant nothing. By Tuesday afternoon, she was loading sacks of flour and lamp oil into her small wagon outside Miller's Mercantile, when one of the wheels dropped into a rut. The wagon tilted sharply. A crate slid sideways. Ruby braced herself and tried lifting the wheel free. It refused to move. A shadow fell across the ground beside her. "Looks stubborn." She looked up. Levi Brooks stood there, holding a coil of rope over one shoulder. The same calm eyes, the same easy expression. Without waiting for praise or permission, he crouched beside the wheel and studied the rut. "Mind if I help?" Ruby stepped back. A few moments later, he wedged a fence rail beneath the wheel and lifted. The wagon rolled free. Simple, quick, done. "Thank you," Ruby said. Levi brushed dust from his hands. "You're welcome." Then he picked up his rope and continued down the street. No lingering conversation, no expectation, just kindness. That surprised her most. Over the following weeks, Dry Creek seemed smaller. She saw him at the livestock market examining wild horses recently brought down from the hills. She saw him at the bakery buying coffee and day-old biscuits before sunrise. She saw him near the public well speaking with ranch hands from the Dawson spread. Each time he greeted her. Each time he treated her exactly the same as anyone else. One windy afternoon, her mule became stuck near a muddy crossing outside town. Before she could solve the problem herself, Levi appeared with 2 other ranch hands. The mule was freed within minutes. Again he asked for nothing. Again he simply tipped his hat and moved on. The town noticed. Of course it did. Dry Creek noticed everything. One evening, Ruby entered Granger Bank carrying a folded receipt book and a small cloth purse. The building smelled of ink, paper, and coal smoke. Behind the counter sat Elias Granger. His silver watch chain glinted beneath the lamp. He reviewed her payment without looking up, then slid the receipt toward her. 2 months, Miss Hayes. Ruby's fingers tightened around the paper. "I know." Elias finally raised his eyes. "The offer still stands. Sell the creek parcel and the debt disappears." "No." His smile was thin. "You always were determined." Outside the bank, Ruby paused beneath the fading sunlight. She didn't realize someone had witnessed the conversation. Across the street, Levi stood near the hitching rail beside a chestnut horse. He wasn't staring, just watching quietly, thoughtfully. That night, long after darkness settled across the valley, a lamp still glowed inside Ruby's cabin. And from the road beyond her gate, another figure stood for several moments beneath the cottonwood trees. Levi Brooks, looking toward the small house by the creek. Not intruding, not approaching, simply thinking. The following morning, Ruby opened her front door. A cold breeze slipped across the porch, and there, leaning against the railing, was a wooden toolbox. She frowned, then looked toward the roof where loose shingles rattled softly in the wind. Footsteps sounded from the yard. Levi appeared carrying a ladder across one shoulder. "Morning, Miss Hayes." Ruby stared at the toolbox, then at him. "What are you doing?" Levi glanced toward the roof. "Winter's coming." For the first time in a very long while, Ruby didn't feel entirely alone. The words stayed with her. After Levi climbed onto the roof, she heard the steady sound of his hammer through the afternoon. Nails tapping into fresh boards, boots shifting against weathered shingles, the occasional scrape of wood. Nothing hurried, nothing careless. By sunset, the loose section above her bedroom had been repaired. Levi climbed down the ladder, wiped his hands on a rag, and packed his tools. Ruby stood on the porch holding 2 enamel coffee cups. She hesitated before offering him one. "Thought you might be thirsty." Levi accepted it with a nod. The evening air carried the smell of pine and distant campfires from the ranches scattered across the valley. For several moments, neither spoke. The silence felt easier than it should have. "You do this for everybody?" Ruby finally asked. Levi looked toward the creek. "Not usually." The answer settled between them. Simple, honest, nothing more. Over the following weeks, Levi became a familiar sight near the cabin. One afternoon he repaired a loose board on the horse shed. Another day he helped stack split firewood beside the porch. When an early windstorm damaged part of the corral fence, he arrived before sunrise carrying fence posts across his shoulder. Ruby never asked him to come. Yet somehow he did, and somehow she began expecting it. Dry Creek noticed. The town always noticed. Conversations lowered when Levi entered the diner. People glanced toward him during church services. Some smiled, others did not. One Sunday after worship, Ruby stepped outside and found 2 women standing near the wagon yard. Their conversation stopped when she approached. A familiar thing. Yet this time she caught a few words before the silence. "Using that cowboy. Poor fool doesn't know." Ruby continued walking. Her shoulders remained straight, but she heard every word. The rumors spread faster after that. At Granger Bank, Elise Granger watched everything from behind polished spectacles. He had owned the bank for nearly 20 years. He knew every debt in Dry Creek, every mortgage, every weakness. One afternoon he unfolded a county map across his desk. Several properties near the creek were marked in pencil. Almost all belonged to him now, except one, Ruby's. His finger rested on her parcel for a long moment. Then he smiled, a cold smile. The following week, Levi stopped by after returning from a horse roundup in the northern hills. His coat carried dust from 3 counties. A folded envelope stuck out from his saddlebag. Ruby noticed it only because the paper slipped halfway free as he lifted a bundle of firewood. He caught it quickly, too quickly. Something crossed his face. A thought, a decision. Then it disappeared. That evening, after Levi left, Ruby found herself thinking about the envelope. The next morning she rode into town for supplies. At the post office, she stepped aside to let the postmaster pass. On the sorting table sat several outgoing letters. One name caught her eye. Levi Brooks, Arizona Territory. Her stomach tightened. She looked away immediately. It was none of her business. Yet the thought followed her home. 3 days later, the truth arrived on its own. Levi stopped by carrying a roll of fencing wire. As he bent to pick up a dropped tool, the same envelope slipped from his coat pocket. This time Ruby saw enough. A ranch near Tucson, land available for purchase, favorable terms, the opportunity of a lifetime. Levi picked up the letter. Neither spoke for several seconds. "You've been planning to leave?" Ruby asked quietly. Levi looked at her. The wind moved through the cottonwoods behind the cabin. "Not yet, but someday." His silence answered before his words did. Ruby nodded once, then turned back toward the porch. The conversation ended there, not with anger, not with blame, something quieter, something heavier. The next Sunday evening, church lanterns glowed softly against the early darkness. Levi arrived a few minutes late. He stepped through the door and glanced automatically toward the last row, toward the chair beside Ruby. The chair was empty. For the first time since the day they met, she wasn't there. Levi remained standing for a moment, long enough for several people to notice. Then he quietly took a seat alone. Outside, the first cold wind of winter moved across Dry Creek, and somewhere beyond town, hidden beneath the dark hills, trouble was already beginning to gather. The following week, snow appeared on the highest ridges. Not much at first, just thin white lines along the redstone cliffs beyond town. But old ranchers noticed. They always did. Men at the feed store spoke in quieter voices. Extra sacks of grain disappeared from shelves. Wagon owners checked wheel grease and lantern oil. Winter was arriving early. Ruby spent most of her days inside the cabin. The curtains remained closed more often now. She worked beside the window, mending shirts for ranch hands and patching worn coats for families, preparing for the cold months ahead. The steady rhythm of needle and thread helped keep her thoughts occupied. It did not stop her from thinking about Levi. Nothing seemed able to do that. Twice he came to the cabin. The first time she pretended not to hear his knock. The second time she opened the door, only long enough to tell him she was busy. Levi stood on the porch with snowflakes gathering on his coat. Ruby. She looked down at the wooden floorboards. You should go. Not arguing, not pleading, just waiting. Then he nodded once. All right. The sound of his boots faded down the porch steps. Ruby closed the door. Only afterward did she realize how tightly she had been holding the edge of it. Days passed. The distance between them grew. The town noticed that too. Then came the storm. It arrived 3 weeks before Christmas. The sky darkened before noon. Clouds rolled over the mountains like smoke. By afternoon, snow swept across the valley in long white curtains. Store owners nailed shutters over windows. The church bell rang twice to warn anyone still traveling. By sunset, visibility had nearly vanished. That same evening, 2 men arrived at Ruby's cabin carrying documents from Granger Bank. The papers were folded inside an oilskin envelope. One carried a lantern. The other held a leather ledger. The debt has matured, Miss Hayes. Ruby stared at the papers. The storm rattled the cabin walls. Tonight? The older man avoided her eyes. Mr. Granger's orders. She understood immediately. This had never been about timing. It had never been about money. Elias wanted her gone before winter fully settled in. Before anyone could interfere. Before questions could be asked. An hour later, Ruby loaded what she could onto her wagon. A trunk, 2 blankets, a box of family papers, a sack of food. The snow continued falling. The wind howled through the cottonwoods near the creek. She wrapped her coat tighter and climbed onto the wagon seat. The mule pulled forward. The cabin disappeared into the storm behind her. Several miles away, Levi sat inside the bunkhouse at Dawson Ranch when a ranch hand burst through the door. You hear about Ruby Hayes? Levi was already standing before the man finished speaking. Outside, darkness swallowed the road. The storm had become a wall of white. Levi saddled his horse without another word. The ride toward the creek was brutal. Snow stung his face. Wind pushed against both horse and rider. Twice he nearly lost the road. Then he found the wagon, or what remained of it. One wheel had broken near a rocky slope. The mule stood trembling in the storm. The wagon lay tilted on its side, but Ruby was nowhere in sight. Levi's stomach dropped. He grabbed the lantern from the wreckage and began searching. Footprints, half covered by snow, leading toward the hills. He followed them, step by step. The trail nearly vanished several times. Then something caught his eye. A narrow light flickering inside the abandoned root cellar, built decades earlier by one of the first settlers. Levi pushed open the door. Ruby sat inside, wrapped in blankets, cold, exhausted, alive. For several seconds, neither spoke. The storm roared outside. Then Ruby let out a shaky breath. I knew you'd come. Levi looked away briefly, as if hearing those words hurt more than the storm itself. While securing the cellar door against the wind, he noticed loose boards along one wall. Behind them sat an old metal box. Forgotten, dust-covered, he pulled it free. Inside were deeds, maps, property surveys, documents dating back nearly 30 years. The name Granger appeared repeatedly. So did another name, Hayes. Levi stared at the papers beneath the lantern light. The truth unfolded piece by piece. Years ago, Elias Granger's father had altered boundary records around the creek. The land Ruby occupied had never legally belonged to the Grangers. The original surveys favored the Hayes property. The documents were signed, stamped, official and hidden. For a long moment neither spoke. The storm howled around the cellar. Ruby looked at the papers, then at Levi. What does it mean? Levi carefully closed the box. His jaw tightened. It means somebody buried the truth. Morning arrived gray and bitterly cold. The storm had finally weakened. Dry Creek lay buried beneath drifts of fresh snow. Ruby stood outside the cellar, watching pale sunlight break through the clouds. Levi approached, carrying the metal box. His expression had changed. Not fear, not anger. Something heavier, something important. Ruby noticed immediately. What is it? Levi looked at her. Snow glittered across the valley below. A long silence stretched between them. Then he spoke quietly. Ruby. He held the box tighter. There's something you need to know. Ruby searched his face. The morning light reflected off the snow around them. The storm had passed, but the valley still looked quiet and unreal beneath its blanket of white. Levi opened the metal box and spread several papers across the rough wooden table inside the root cellar. Old surveys, property maps, county seals, signatures faded with age. Ruby leaned closer. For nearly an hour, they studied every page together. By the time they rode back toward Dry Creek, neither of them spoke much. The truth was too large, too unexpected. And for the first time in years, Ruby carried something stronger than hope. She carried proof. Word traveled quickly once the documents reached town. Within days, a lawyer from Helena arrived by stagecoach. His name was Walter Finch, a gray-haired attorney who had spent 20 years settling land disputes across Montana territory. He reviewed every document, every survey marker, every signature, every county record. The investigation lasted almost 3 weeks. Dry Creek watched closely. So did Elias Granger. For the first time since Ruby had known him, the banker looked uneasy. Winter settled deeper over the valley. Snow lined the rooftops. Smoke drifted from chimneys. Christmas came and went quietly. Then one cold January morning, the findings became official. The original boundary records had been altered decades earlier. The Creek property belonged to the Hayes family. It always had. The debt attached to the land was invalid. Several neighboring parcels acquired by the Granger family were also called into question. Elias Granger stood silently as the documents were read aloud inside the county office. No arguments followed. No dramatic scene, just facts. The truth had waited a long time. Now it finally had a voice. When Ruby stepped outside, townspeople were gathered along the boardwalk. Some nodded. Some offered awkward smiles. Others simply removed their hats. People who had spent years avoiding her suddenly found reasons to speak. Ruby accepted their kindness politely. But she remembered the empty chairs. Those memories did not disappear overnight. That evening she returned to her cabin. The repaired roof stood strong against the snow. The creek flowed beneath a layer of ice. Everything she thought she would lose was still there. Yet something felt unsettled. Levi. For weeks he had been helping with lawyers, surveys, and meetings. Now the crisis was over, and suddenly he seemed distant. 2 mornings later she discovered why. His horse stood saddled outside Dawson Ranch. Bedrolls secured, supplies packed. A folded map tucked into his coat pocket. Arizona, the word landed like a stone inside her chest. Levi noticed her standing by the fence. For a long moment, neither moved. Finally, she managed a smile. It wasn't her best effort, but it was honest. I guess congratulations are in order. Levi looked down, then back at her. Ruby forced herself to continue. You worked hard for that dream. The wind stirred across the snowy pasture. Somewhere in the distance, a horse whinnied. Levi reached into his coat, pulled out a folded document, and handed it to her. Ruby opened it slowly. The purchase agreement for the Arizona land. Signed, then torn cleanly through the middle. She stared at it, confused, then stunned. Levi rubbed the back of his neck, a habit she had seen whenever he struggled to find the right words. I spent years chasing that place. Ruby looked up. Why? He laughed softly. Not because anything was funny, because the answer was simple. I thought I was looking for a home. The wind tugged at his coat. His eyes never left hers. Turns out I found one here. Ruby's breath caught. For several seconds, neither spoke. The world seemed very quiet. A week later, church bells rang across Dry Creek. Sunday morning, just like the day they first met. Families filled the pews. Children whispered. Boots creaked against the wooden floor. Ruby stepped inside and paused. The same chair remained beside hers. The chair no one had wanted. The chair Levi had chosen. Levi walked down the aisle carrying a small box. Not fancy, not expensive. Just polished wood worn smooth by careful hands. When he reached the row, he placed the box on the empty chair. Then looked at her. The entire church seemed to disappear. Only his voice remained. The first day I sat here, it was because there wasn't another seat. A few people smiled. Levi's eyes softened. But that's not why I'd choose it now. He opened the box. Inside rested a simple gold ring. Nothing extravagant. Just honest, like him. He glanced at the chair, then back at Ruby. Now I sit here because I don't want to sit beside anyone else. Ruby covered her mouth. Tears blurred her vision. For a moment she couldn't speak. The same church, the same chair, but everything had changed. Finally she nodded, then laughed through her tears and said yes. 5 years later, the church bells still rang every Sunday. Dry Creek had grown. New families had arrived. New stores lined the main road. Ruby no longer sat alone. Levi sat beside her. Their young son swung his feet beneath the pew. Their daughter leaned against Ruby's shoulder, half asleep after a long morning. The service ended. People filed outside, and near the back row a young woman sat alone, new to town, quiet, unsure. No one had taken the seat beside her. Ruby noticed immediately. She glanced at Levi. He smiled. The same smile she had first seen years ago. Ruby stood, lifted her chair, and carried it across the room. The young woman looked up in surprise. Ruby sat down beside her. Nothing dramatic, nothing grand. Just a simple choice. The kind that changes a life. Outside, the church bell rang once more over Dry Creek. Snow melted slowly from the mountains. The creek kept flowing. And in the place where loneliness had once lived, something gentler had finally taken root. Home. Maybe that's why stories like this stay with us. Not because of the ring, not because of the land, not even because Levi chose to stay. They stay with us because, at one point or another, most of us have known what it feels like to sit in a room full of people and still feel alone. Maybe you've had a season when the world seemed to move on without you. Maybe you've watched doors close, watched people pull away, or wondered whether anyone truly saw the person you were beneath the rumors, mistakes, losses, or scars. And maybe that's why Ruby's story matters. Because sometimes healing doesn't arrive with grand speeches. Sometimes it begins with something as simple as a chair pulled a little closer, a kind word. A person who stays when leaving would be easier. The older I get, the more I believe that love isn't measured by promises. It's measured by presence, by who shows up, by who keeps choosing you on ordinary days, through hard winters and uncertain roads. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear from you. Tell me in the comments. What was your favorite moment in Ruby and Levi's journey? And if you enjoy stories about second chances, quiet courage, enduring love, and the unexpected ways people find their way home, I hope you'll stay a little longer with us. There are many more journeys waiting just down the trail, and I'd be honored to share them with you in the next story.